the intro just so it's official?
Sure.
I'm screen sharing, right? Is this still?
I'll put you in the corner. Cool. All right, welcome to Denver Health Workers and Teach Yourself. This is the third, I think, installation. We got Peter Dellavechia, one of the Denver Health paramedics, who's going to teach us how to stop, negotiate, and listen. All right, take it away, Peter.
What's up? Special encore presentation because of catastrophic technical failure on multiple levels. But it's new, it's improved. There's tons of you here. Appreciate you coming. Alrighty, let's dive into it. So I'm gonna try and remember to do the slides this time because I was totally skipping over slides last time. All right, stop, negotiate, and listen. Like ICE, vanilla ICE is stop, collaborate, and listen. There's some collaboration too. So my name's Peter Dellavechia. I'm currently a paramedic at Denver Health. I'm a Denver Health Workers United member. I'm excited to do this education program, be involved with that. Before I was a paramedic, I was a paramedic, and then I was a police officer, and then I was a paramedic again. And my background in law enforcement was I did the crisis intervention training, so I have that certification, and I was a crisis negotiator with the local SWAT team when I was a police officer. So I have the FBI crisis negotiator certification as well. So all that is going to come into play. I'm going to mix the two schools of thought here. All right, I told myself I was not going to mess up the slides. Okay, the philosophy of crisis negotiation. As you see, the guy from the last slide has become your crazed patient after a number of years of some sort of drug use. And you're encountering this person. You don't know what to do, but you need to get them to do something. This philosophy, if you can come back to this, and I'll break it down even more simply than this. This philosophy, if you remember this every time, it'll at least get you started, or at least get you to the point where you're going to realize, I'm not going to get anywhere with this person. I'd venture to guess like a vast majority of the time, if you work this process and you stick with this philosophy, that you're going to have a lot of success. So it starts with maintaining self-control. The only aspect of a crisis situation we have absolute control over is our own emotions. When confronted with a difficult patient, the first step is not to control their behavior, but to control our own behavior. Take a step back, look at the situation objectively. The person may be in crisis, but it's totally out of their control, and you might be the person to fix it. You have to have patience, work your process, have a measured approach. Don't confuse getting even with getting what you want. The patient may have said something to piss you off. With the foundation of self-control that you've practiced so much, you can work towards de-escalation of the tension. Focus on the process and not the outcome. Just keep working it. And we'll talk more about the process, the specific process here in a minute. By working towards this process, you'll work to an outcome that will be best for all involved. Take a step back and remember to be respectful. This is all based on listening. This whole program is based on listening. And the foundation to good active listening skills is coming from a place of respect. It's very difficult to truly actively listen to someone if you don't at least respect their point of view. So I want you to always remember, all people want to be treated with dignity and respect. All people want to be asked rather than being told to do something. All people want to be told why they're being asked to do something. All people want to be given options rather than threats. And all people want a second chance or the ability to save face. And you can't do actively listening, like I said, without coming from a place of this respect and remembering those key things. So this, like I said before, this all starts with listening, and this means actually listening. You don't want to just be thinking of the next negotiator technique you're going to use. And it's okay if there's pauses and awkwardness. Sometimes it's useful. It's okay if it takes a lot of time. Crisis intervention training specifically says, spend 2 hours now instead of 6 1-hour calls over the next month. And finally, circling back to the self-control, I want you to remember to breathe. I want you to physically step back in these situations. Part of that's safety, part of that's remaining a little bit detached and being present in the moment. Jocko Willink, he's a Navy SEAL motivational speaker, disciplined guru, leadership guru. He talks about like physically taking a step back from a situation to be able to view it objectively. And so we talked about it's important to maintain self-control, but the easiest way to control yourself is to kind of control your breathing, because that's physiologically and mentally one of the strongest tools we have for self-control. So you can practice mindfulness in your time off to be able to come in and out of the situation, like not zone out and not get too focused into things, and remain objective. And you can practice that breath work as well. I always take a big deep breath before going into a stressful call and just kind of prepare myself for everything there. So that's the philosophy. And the process that I mentioned before, like I said, starts with active listening. After you spend some time actively listening to people, you're going to build empathy. After that, you'll gain rapport. And then you begin to have some influence over the person. And there's two different schools of thought with the influence stage. There's kind of like a problem solving or an influence stage. And the FBI just calls it influence, and crisis intervention calls it problem solving. But overall, it's that kind of collaboration we were kind of mentioning in the beginning. And then once you have a significant amount of influence over the person and you've collaborated towards a problem and given them options, right, you can get them to do what you need them to do. This is called the behavioral change stairway model, and it's the way that FBI hostage negotiators approach every crisis situation. So what is the active listening process? You want to start with listening. You give the patient a hearing, or your subject, or whoever you're trying to negotiate with. You're going to give them a hearing. Depending on the situation, you may be the first person to actually give them this space to vent. And you're going to be the first person to acknowledge that they may be in this crisis. You're going to acknowledge the patient's points, and that doesn't necessarily equate to agreement, but you can acknowledge somebody's point of view without actively being like, yeah, you're totally right. You can be like, I understand where you're coming from. And we'll talk about saying I understand a little bit in the future, but acknowledgement doesn't necessarily equate agreement, but if you can agree with them, it's great for building rapport. Don't concede, find common ground, and just create that positive atmosphere for the next influence stages up the way. Some obstacles that you might encounter for the positivity, the sense of positivity, and the agreement is unsatisfied needs, fear, they're not ready, you haven't spent enough time. They're not de-escalated, they're still at a really high emotional state. An inclination to perceived aggression. A lot of times cops run into issues with this because they automatically have this like aura of authority. And I know even myself sometimes in a civilian role, encounter a police officer and I'm like, ooh. So you got to think somebody in crisis is going to be on the defensive a little bit. They have a sense that they might be misunderstood or mistreated. They may be just completely aggrieved or overwhelmed and not being able to be positive or come to an agreement or even like engage with you. And then don't argue. I mean, this is pretty simple and like straightforward, but it's really difficult in the heat of the moment to not go back and forth. But the goal is de-escalation, and the goal is not the escalation that argument brings. And that's where self-control, mindfulness, and keeping your ego in check is really important. So I got some pro tips for you. People don't always say what they mean. Attempt to listen for meaning. Unsatisfied needs might be one of those things. You're not in the position to be meeting a patient's demands, but you may be able to help satisfy these needs. They could be like basic human needs, like if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Physiological needs, security, physical or emotional needs are those basic ones, or the more higher level ones. They need recognition that the person's view is understood. They might want to feel some control. That's why options are important. In these really stressful situations, if you give these people a little bit of control, it's a good way to get towards the next stage of rapport building in the active listening process. They might just want to be heard. They might want to air their grievances. They, another higher level need might be like just saving face. Like it's really embarrassing to be in a crisis, so they might just want to save face. And then some people in crisis want to feel like they achieved something. So this photo I included, and I didn't even get to mention it in the last one, but this was from, this is the back of police department's hostage negotiation van. And this is like the local police department interfacing with the sheriff's department that I was a part of to do a negotiation on an active subject. And you can see that it's kind of a slow process. I was in the intel gathering part, and I was just on this end of the van, and I hesitate to like give you all the tools of the hostage negotiator because it is such a team-based effort. The guy in the end is the first, and he's the one talking, and then the second kind of filters all the information coming from like the third and the intelligence people. So keep that in mind, that you may need to tag team someone in these situations, in these crisis situations. And even like the best of the best, like those most famous of hostage situations, like there's a whole team working behind it, and you don't necessarily have to have all the answers. And whenever you get to a point where you don't have the answer, you always either have your team member to fall back on or your active listening skills. So that's why I included it in this slide here. So these are the active listening skills. They stand for, the acronym is more pies. So the first one is minimal encouragers, and these are used during telling somebody a story. We've all been on the phone and somebody's like, you're like talking and talking and talking and you haven't heard them say anything. And the best way to show them that you're listening is, yeah, really, okay. And like not sarcastically, but you're like, oh, okay, I see where you're coming from, you know. Some people avoid okay because it opens up the retort of, it's not okay. But just like use your discretion, and it's easy to like walk that back and be like, no, I'm sorry, I was just listening to you. And then you'll know that, hey, maybe don't say okay to that person again. But some of the, like the crisis intervention training, I think was that, is like, don't say that word. But I mean, use your judgment. Open-ended questions. They're more than yes or no. What, how, and when. They convey interest. They give freedom to tell a story. They limit the feeling of interrogation. They limit the like pigeonholed questions of like where the person may just want to say yes or no to your question without being elaborate. And then like there's this weird dynamic of leading questions where like they think you want to say them to say something, and then it just spirals out of control. So if you ask an open-ended question, you get the most amount of honesty, and you get the most amount of time to like for them to tell a story. And then I specifically left out why, and that's one I would avoid if you can, and we'll talk about that. So reflection is also known as mirroring. It's repeating the last few words. So they said something like, she doesn't pay attention to me when it makes me angry. And you go, it makes you angry. And this one was like awkward for me to inject into conversations and like kind of get a feel for. But then the more I like am aware of it, the more I catch myself doing it. And it kind of highlights that you don't necessarily have to force these, but just know that these are tools that you can kind of practice in your day-to-day. The FBI is very much big on you not repeating foul language, but you know, sometimes if you drop a couple curse words and you break that like authority figure view, especially somebody in uniform, you can kind of build a little rapport that way. So use your judgment on that. I mean, don't go down the phase of arguing or something like that, but use your judgment. Emotion labeling. Dr. Mike Webster says, if possible, never let a feeling go without labeling it. People love to have others understand how they feel. So like play a game with somebody. Like if you're on a long negotiation, like try and label as many of their emotions as you can. I can hear the anger in your voice. That sounds frustrating. And even if you get the emotion wrong, you'll build some rapport by trying, because they'll be like, that sounds really angry. And they'll be like, no, it's really frustrating. And you're like, oh, it is frustrating. And it's like, wow, this guy's actually listening to me. And then pro tip for backing out of the long wrong label. So if you label something like, they're like, wow, that sounds angry. And then they're like, I'm not angry. And be like, well, I didn't say that you were angry. I said you sounded angry. So you can say like, that's how it sounded. That was my perception of things. It's kind of like the iMessage that we'll get to. Paraphrasing. In your own words, restate what they've said. Paraphrasing is brief, and it's kind of like labeling the theme. So she's always talking and doesn't pay attention. So you say, so she doesn't listen to you, huh? So that's a smaller one. Summary will be the bigger one, but paraphrasing is brief restatements. iMessaging, we all learned this in like elementary school or whatever. It's a non-confrontational and non-judgment way to inject your feelings and emotions. And this will come up here in a minute again. So effective pauses. People hate awkward silence like that, right? Pose a question and wait. It conveys thoughtfulness in the sense that you haven't just been waiting for your turn to talk, rather you've been like actively listening, right? So pausing, we've all had the teacher or the presenter who like pauses, and then you're like key into it. So try and pause, and I use it a lot, and I really try and use it a lot. And I think it's kind of like a superpower for like police interrogation ways. Is like you can pose a question and you can just leave that sucker out there, because it'll get a little too awkward for them sometimes to stand and leave that question out in the open, because it's kind of their turn, right? So you'll be like, so how did we get here? And then hopefully they'll take over. And sometimes you can just see how long it hangs out there, and if not, like pose a different question. And then finally, summary. In summary, let me see if I get this straight, is the way to do a summary. So it's the long version of the paraphrasing. It lets them feel heard and then also correct the record. It's great if you have to hand off to another person. I like, even on my day-to-day ambulance calls, if I have to do a handoff to the doctor in front of the patient, I make sure to get the story top to bottom. That way, when you're transferring them over, it shows that you listened and it wasn't wasted for them to put their trust in you. And then they might be able to trust the person that you trust because you've told them the right story, right? So pro tips. Once these skills are learned, they diminish. You can use them in your day-to-day, and you can practice them in your day-to-day, especially those awkward ones. The more they are used, the better they become, and you'll start to recognize how you naturally use them. And you don't have to be a negotiator to be a better listener. And the best negotiators and the best crisis de-escalators are the ones that listen. So like I keep hammering, like if you just listen. And then the final addendum to this pro tip is, don't negotiate your significant other when you awkwardly inject like iMessages, or it's very difficult for me to understand you while you're shouting at me. They'll be like, stop negotiating me. I know what you're trying to do. So just listen to your significant other. All right, cruising along. So this is kind of like I said, use your judgment with language, but definitely consider what you're saying. These are my like avoid and instead thing here. So think about the difference between you always make me angry, and I feel angry when this happens. You can activate an anger response. So that's where those iMessage comes in point. Use very like accusatory. iMessage, it's like hard for them to argue that like you felt that way, right? Why can activate frustration or desperation. So like, police officer, why were you speeding? I was like late for work and this is pissing me off. Why do you want to kill yourself? I don't know, man. Like my life is fucked up, right? Why were you late? Because I was trying to speed and then the cop pulled me over. And why didn't you turn in your homework? I don't know why. I got a lot of things going on in my life. So if you use the word what or how, it allows the patient or the subject to point to a specific instance or feeling, and may help the feeling of being overwhelmed. It gives you like an instant empathy boost. So what's making you speed today? Like, I'm late for work. Sorry, man. Or what's making you feel like you want to kill yourself? And then they can speak to that individual like instance of like that tipped them over the edge. And then how come you're late? How can I help you like turn in your homework, right? So I understand. Some instructors will say like you never could understand what these people are going through. But the issue, and a lot of people have shared experiences, and I think it can be useful. But the issue doesn't necessarily revolve around the fact that you can't empathize, but it's a quick jump to that influence and problem solving stage. And it's well intentioned, but it's like a counterproductive shortcut. So you're better off demonstrating understanding through rapport building and active listening skills. Don't just verbalize it. So some ways you can do that is be like, I get that, man. I get that. Or I'm listening. And that's where some of those active listening skills will come in. So calm down. Never in the history of calm down has calm down ever calmed anyone down. Not once. So I tell this story about this girl who I would regularly de-escalate. And it was like a magic bullet for me to be like, it's difficult for me to understand you when you raise your voice. Because it's like, she was autistic and would get into these crisis situations. And it just worked every time for her because it was like, well, this is the guy who's going to help me solve this problem. She had enough like wherewithal in the crisis to acknowledge that. And if he's here to help me solve that problem, if I keep shouting at him, I'm not going to get what I want. The other thing you can do is say like, I can see how angry you are. Help me understand, right? You should, like the word, like the statement, you should do this or you shouldn't do that. It's judgmental and it's kind of like a patronizing jump to problem solving. Like most people in crisis have been told their whole lives of like what they should and shouldn't do and how to get in and out of these situations. So, where did I put her? It's like hidden behind the camera. So what do you think you should do? Good one. So, and then zingers. Zingers are like, if it feels really good to say something and you'll know it when you see it because you're like, oh, fucking, they said that. Like, just don't say it. Just stay away from zingers. Keep that ego in check. If it feels like really good to say, like, try and avoid it. You're going to knock yourself down that staircase of the behavioral change. And sometimes when you go all the way down and you destroy rapport, like it's gonna be really hard to build it back up, and it'll definitely be hard for the next person, even if it ever gets to that point. So I have the pro tip for this one. Okay, outside of these pitfalls, I want you to remember it's not about what you say, it's about how you say it. Your tone indicates your attitude, and this speaks louder than your words. A calm, controlled demeanor be more effective than a brilliant argument. The example they gave us in the FBI school was they did a study, and there was this long line at this bank, right? And they came up to people and they cut in line and they said, hey, do you mind if I jump in front of you? And most people would be like, no. It was like 60% of people would allow them to. It was like a little more than half would be like, 40% would shoot him down, right? When they said, hey, I need to cut in front of you because I'm running late, people would be like, oh yeah, totally. 90% of the time they would be allowed into the position in line. And then it was something like, if they said, hey, can I cut in front of you because I need to cut in front of you? It was like 88% of the people were like, yeah, all right, whatever, and it was, they attributed somewhat to that was the fact that they used the word because, and they gave a reason for what they were going to do. So sometimes, like, if you rephrase how you're going to do something, answer those persons why, like they want to know why they have to do something. It can be really useful. So. Psychologist Carl Rogers is quoted in the FBI hostage negotiators manual, and this is to understand his feelings so well that you could summarize them for him. That's like true empathy, to like really be able to like summarize and take that time. I like that quote. That's why I quoted it in there. So empathy is an identification and understanding of another situation's feelings and motives. Identification is not opposition. Like, you're not going to be coming from a confrontational standpoint, like you're not trying to solve problems. Understanding isn't necessarily agreement, and empathy is not sympathy, where sympathy is an expression of pity or sorrow, and it's just like not productive in these situations. Empathy isn't necessarily about being nice. You don't need to feel what they feel. More so, you kind of just need to see what they see, if that makes sense. You just got to put the camera perspective on their side of the room for a little bit. Empathy absorbs tension. To help build empathy, appear willing to help. So body language is really, really important in this. Allow for venting without interruption, and ignore those personal attacks. Now for body language, consider somebody listening to you like this or like this versus, standing here or like arms down at your sides, right? Something that I was a police officer did when I was a police officer was I would stand like this, because it would give me that like blocking of my hand and that feeling of safety and security, but like very inquisitive, right? Be careful of playing into people's delusions. Listen to their delusions, but don't be like, the UFO told me that you need to go to the hospital. You may be dealing with people with severe mental illness and drug abuse, and this just isn't helpful. Empathize with the distress that the delusions are causing. Even if they did this stuff to themselves through drugs or alcohol or too much ketamine or whatever, they're still in a crisis situation, and they still may be panicked and still may be suffering, right? And like I said, try not to buy into those delusions. Hear them out, but don't try and use a delusion as a tool, I guess is my point. So pro tip, tools for empathy. Let me be sure I heard what you just said. It would be a good thing to say for building some empathy. Let me be sure I heard what you just said. And then I could see how you would be upset over this. It's kind of like I get that. Just a couple little tools there. Vanilla ice again. So rapport is the next step on the stairway model above empathy. Rapport is a relationship of trust. Once you convey empathy by gaining understanding of the situation, you can build a relationship of some trust. Take your time. Demonstrate patience through a willingness to spend the time necessary to resolve the problem. Continue to acknowledge compliance with thank you, and truly say you're sorry when you screw up. If you misspeak or you say I'm okay, and they're like, I'm not okay, just say I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. Apologize. Negotiators call this period of developing the rapport and kind of taking your time called stalling for time. There's been books by that title, and there's like famous hostage negotiators. Stalling for time. The people you'll see will most likely be in crisis. You won't necessarily be in the true like hostage negotiation situation where you're giving some like, I want 2 hostages for 3 pizzas and we're getting hungry in here. So you're going to be dealing with people in crisis. And even true hostage negotiators are rarely dealing with somebody where it's like a bank robbery and inside man and that stuff. So they're 90% of the time they're dealing with like non-hostage situations, even if they have a hostage. So it's a crisis where the person needs to be a de-escalator, or else they're going to kill this person who's maybe close to them. It's not something that you're going to be able to trade for. So my point in saying all this is these people will be very, very heavily elevated, and it's very difficult for the body to maintain that level of arousal and the fight or flight response for a long period of time. So the idea is to stall for time, talk to them, let them vent until those emotions can kind of drop off and they can get back to their rational brain a little bit. Be honest. Don't ever lie. Be very, very careful if you embellish or make up a story from your own life, because sometimes it's hard to keep that stuff straight. And sometimes I've tried it and it's made me kind of uncomfortable and hard to come across as sincere, which could be picked up on by an astute person in crisis. And then your rapport is never going to recover from a lie. So if you do lie, that's it. You're back down the stairway like we talked about. And the only way to make sure that you don't get caught in a lie is like truly not to lie. Promise only what you can deliver and follow up on the promise. You're going to see these people again. So if you promise somebody a cigarette, or you're going to walk them to the ambulance, or you're going to let them save face in some way, make sure you honor that. Like I said, you're going to see these people again, or somebody's going to see these people again. People like rarely go into crisis once in their life. The example was that autistic girl that I would always de-escalate. One time we went to the house and she had crawled out onto the roof. I crawled up on the roof after her and she made a run for the end, and I tackled her, and it was this big, thing. And I don't know if she was actually going to jump, but the next time we responded to the house and she's on the roof, she was like, "Don't you come up here. If you even come near here, I'm jumping off the roof." And then I was like, okay, I actually have to use these active listening skills I've been trained on. And we did. And I was recognized for tackling the girl on the roof because it was like heroic, but I thought it was way more difficult and time intensive and an intellectual challenge to de-escalate her off the roof and get her to come down on her own. So, pro tip: use self-disclosure as necessary, and it's okay to tell stuff from your own story. It's really, really, really effective, but only do what you're comfortable with or want your coworkers knowing. So once you get to that rung on the ladder, rapport, you're going to get to the influence stage. FBI calls this stage influence, and crisis intervention calls this stage problem solving. Influence is the power or capacity to cause a change or a change in thought or action. You can't have any influence over somebody in a crisis situation, really. It's just too much, and that arousal level is so high. You got to get into that logical brain that we talked about. So diffuse these emotions before moving to any problem solving. Problem solving requires logic and not that emotion, and avoid premature problem solving while the subject is still emotional. So that's like 7 different ways of me saying, like, take your time and de-escalate first. When you're ready to start problem solving, clarify the issues and make sure both of you are on the same page. That's where the paraphrasing, the summary, and all that stuff comes really in handy. Discuss the different realistic outcomes. Be realistic about the patient or the subject's demand. So I'm not going to the hospital. Well, I legally have to take you to the hospital. I would lose my job and I would lose my career if I didn't take you to the hospital. However, I'm more than happy to like allow you to walk over to the ambulance since you've calmed down, and make appropriate concessions at this point. So if you promised a cigarette break, just give them the cigarette break. Take it in small steps sometimes. For us in the EMS world, sometimes you can get a little bit by asking them to walk to the ambulance. And it's like, oh, your blood pressure is really high, and you have a lot more of those like negotiation tools there. And like, if they're in the problem solving stage, hopefully they're not as much in the emotional stage. So include the patient in the problem solving. Like, it's like toddler brain at this point. Like, give them 2 options that you're good with and go from there, right? This photo here is our new STAR van. I don't remember what it stands for, but it's a mental health response van. So it's staffed with a paramedic and a clinician crisis worker, and it's dedicated to the downtown area of Denver and is working to kind of deal with some of the calls that maybe police officers shouldn't be responding to and deal with some of those mental health crises. It's modeled after some teams around the country, and it's really able to connect people, like de-escalate and diffuse and deal with people in like mental health crisis and putting people on mental health holds and stuff and dealing with those specific calls, similar to the crisis counselors that ride with the police officers. But it also connects people with resources that we're not even trained to do as police officers or paramedics or whatever. The clinician can take people to the crisis center if they don't fit the need for the emergency room, and they can hook people up with resources to get them where they need to go, or give somebody a ride to the shelter or something like that. So that's why I include that in there in the problem solving sector, right? So now you've built some influence, you decided to problem solve, and you're at behavioral change. Congratulations. It's really, really difficult. Sometimes it goes quickly and it's difficult, and sometimes you might not ever get here, but working that process and working those steps is really effective, and it all starts with listening. I want you to consider safety. I want you to continue to be mindful, keep your guard up, and remember that you're going to have to help them through those next steps. Specifically talking about safety, time and distance are your friends. Avoid too close, too fast, too soon. Keep a reactionary gap, and remember that time is on your side. So a reactionary gap is if you outstretched your hand and they outstretched their hand, that like 6 feet or so is how far you want to stay away from somebody who's in a crisis situation, because it'll let your brain have enough time to react to at least do like a defensive stop. Assess the need for more people. Like we talked about with the negotiation van, are you not vibing with this person? Do we need to try building rapport with someone else? Keep your ego in check and let that other person jump in if it gets to that point. I let my partners, yeah, whatever. Will you need the police in a particular situation? Will you need somebody with a higher level of training? Will you need SWAT negotiators? Has the person barricaded themselves in the bathroom and you have no idea what they have behind that bathroom door? For behavior, monitor that behavior closely. Continue to stay step back. Keep that reactionary gap and stay conscious of the entire scene. Watch their hands. I don't like having people's hands in their pockets. And you can verbalize that through an iMessage. Like, it makes me, I feel uncomfortable when you have your hands in your pockets. You mind taking them out slowly? We have a lot of crazy, might not want to say crazy people, but we have a lot of people who sometimes have weapons on them, and it makes me feel safer. Look for signs of aggression. So the tense in the jaw, I was able to do this on the other one, like grinding their teeth, right? Clench fists. A fighting stance. So a fighting stance is like if you had both your feet side by side, one of them's like cocked back, like they're ready to take a blow, right? Set boundaries for agitated or animated behavior. So if they're getting out of control, you can be direct, and remember that at the end of the day, you're allowing them the hearing, but you still have to keep everybody safe. And this applies for outside of EMS, and this applies for outside of like police. Like if you're coming to de-escalate someone, or you're tasked with trying to calm this person down until somebody else gets there, you're trying to control the situation to keep yourself safe and the other person safe. So set those boundaries. Discourage dangerous behavior and anticipate spontaneous behavior. Try and think about like what you're going to do if they pull something out of their pocket. There's not a lot you can do if you're not trained or armed or something like that, but just try and think about what could happen. I know it's a lot to think about, but if you can remember 2 things, maybe listening and try and stay safe and anticipate stuff, you'll be good. So if they've already panicked or lost it, they're likely to be easily triggered again. So if they've already freaked out, if they've already been aggressive, keep that in mind moving forwards for like dispositions of like, I'm going to put them on the bench seat instead of tying them down to the stretcher. Maybe that option is off the table, leaving them on the bench seat on the way to the hospital, because you've shown like a level of aggression. You don't have to tell them directly right away, but keep that in mind. If somebody's here and you get them down here slowly, they may go right back up there, and it's hard to tell when or how that's going to happen. Be realistic about who you try and de-escalate. Are they completely altered and far gone? There was a good question last session, and it was like, what do you do with somebody who's got like dementia and a memory of like 15 minutes? And you do what you can to set boundaries and build a little rapport and listen to them and try and explain things. but that's not the person that you might necessarily be able to get like to come out of the house willingly if they're just so far gone or so drugged out. You'll develop the ability to like see if they're going to be able to engage and just make that decision through a little bit of active listening to start. But the more times you de-escalate people, the more times you'll be able to like, is this even worth it? It's like a clinical gestalt thing. You'd be surprised who you can de-escalate though. And and like I said, you'll learn this over time. You can de-escalate so many more people than you would think you can just through these skills. And I like constantly surprise myself. I'm like, wait, that was way easier than I thought it was going to be. And then finally, do some fighting training. Learn how to defend yourself is the key here. So I don't care if it's karate or jiu-jitsu or boxing or whatever. Having that confidence in your physical safety and security will give you the ability to keep your ego in check and hold that self-control, because you won't get as amped. And if you do some sort of sparring too, you're like used to making decisions in a high stress situation as well. So it's super useful. It's not like the most necessary tool, but it is gives you that confidence, and it also gives you that way to protect yourself in that last resort if there's that spontaneous or anticipated behavior, unanticipated behavior. And then I just have this last little note here was like, it'll keep you calm and it'll keep you present. So I just wanted to give a couple of examples from recent times where I've been successful and unsuccessful in de-escalation. And neither one was a total complete win or a total complete loss, but they were both learning experiences for me. The one that jumps out the most was we responded to a residence for a female who was just losing it because there were spiders all over her back apartment and she was a mess, just like painted on eyebrows and like all different directions and like disheveled hair and drug picking marks and just wholly panicked. But she was pregnant. We didn't really know how far along she was, but there was definitely concern that if we were to just grab her and sedate her, that there could be further harm to an already damaged baby. So I kicked the people off the scene who thought I was pandering to her by listening to her, and I spent the time needed to listen to where she was coming from and take it step by step to the ambulance where we could get her on the bench seat, and we got her to the hospital laughing and joking, and it was way easier for the nurse and it was healthier on the patient. So it was definitely one of those situations where I came in, I was like, holy crap, this lady's nuts. And I just worked the process and I stayed calm. And if it hadn't worked, I still would have probably grabbed her and sedated her, but like, let's at least give it a chance. The other one that was more of a unsuccessful de-escalation, we responded to a residence for a male who was freaking out because he took too much medical marijuana edibles. And he came panicking out of the apartment and met us in the parking lot that his like colon was exploding into his head. And we like calmed him down, and he was like, we were like, dude, you're just tripping. Like it's weed, you're good. And we left him at home and he was like, oh, cool. We set him up with some snacks and some Netflix. And we thought that was going to be like the rest of the night for him, was just chilling. We're like, this sucks. We've all been there. Let's ride it out. Like 20, 30 minutes later, he calls back markedly more stoned and freaking out. Like, can I just have that sedative option that you had mentioned before? And we're like, yeah, whatever. Like, walk down the hospital, put him on the ambulance bench seat, started an IV, gave him some medication, was flushing the medication through, and he lost it. And it was back up to that escalation level. And it was a knockdown, drag out fight. Police were so far away, and I ended up in the emergency room. He ended up with felony charges. And if I had put him on the stretcher and remembered that he had been at this high level and could easily go back up to that, I would have had more control over him. It was a learning experience for me. And it was a reminder not to get too cocky with your amazing negotiator skills. despite all the training that you've had tonight. So I think we got a lot of participants here tonight, but if anybody wants to jump out and share some stories, or ask any questions, and then we'll wrap this up. Okay. Jacob? Ken? No? All right, cool. So finally, if you take anything away, safety, always a thing. People say safety first and stuff, but keep safety in mind. But the philosophy is what matters. So maintain self-control, have patience and work the process, be respectful, actively listen, and breathe. And if you work that, you'll be a lot more successful, and your coworkers will see you as like some sort of de-escalation savant. That's all I got for you. Thanks for coming to DHWU Teach Yourself encore presentation. I hope it's recording. Who knows at this point? Check us out. The next one's only in a week from now. Harm reduction.
Yeah, it's October 13th. It's a Tuesday at 7 p.m. It's going to be about harm reduction. It'll be a fantastic presentation. Tell everyone, tell your friends. Get them all coming. The more people who come to this thing, the better. So, yeah. Right on. Thanks for doing this again, Peter. And this will be up on YouTube here in a minute.
Cool. Blast it out there. Like and subscribe. Smash
like, subscribe, share. The whole 9.
And as a flight attendant at Frontier Airlines, I just wanted to thank you